Welcome students or student. This is going to be a quick and dirty introduction to the modern period in philosophy, the last period we're going to be studying. You're essentially just looking at the computer screen in my office. You can also print off the PowerPoint from Blackboard, have that with you and take notes. There will be a journal entry at the end. Part of that journal entry is going to ask you to decide, at least kind of in a preliminary way, which modern philosopher you're going to want to study so that I can prepare those readings for you. You may even think of a philosopher or a writer whom you'd like to study whom I do not mention. I'm open to suggestion. What we do with that seminar period is really going to be determined by your choices. First, let's review. Let's kind of look back at the journey we've taken from the beginning of the semester. We've seen the highlights of the ancient world, both Greek and Roman philosophy. We've taken a real quick look at the Middle Ages. Now we're moving into the modern era. And to understand what makes the modern era what it is, we have to kind of look back and see what the ancient and medieval philosophers were trying to do. Some people think that we are now in the postmodern era. Have we finished with modernity? Are we now moving into some sort of new project? I personally don't think so. You can decide that for yourself. So we started with the so-called Ionian or pre-Socratic philosophers before 200 BC in the ancient Greek-speaking world. And we studied two philosophers who tried to come up with some idea or some answer to the question, what is the arche, or the basic principle of everything? What is the one unifying idea or explanation that can tie together the many diverse things that we see in the natural and the human worlds? So we studied one philosopher whose basic idea was everything changes. You can't step into the same river twice. We studied another philosopher whose basic idea was everything is atoms. So just be aware of who those philosophers were. I'm sure you can name them for yourselves right now. Talk about it among yourselves if you're together. Then we took a look at Socrates, who was executed, or in the opinion of some of you, committed suicide, I think in 399 BC, and his follower, Plato. Both of them shared this notion that what is truly real is what you cannot see. That to come to the knowledge of the truth and reality, you've got to rise beyond the appearances of the physical body and the appearances of things. Socrates in Plato's dialogue, The Republic, which you're familiar with from other courses, says the idea of the good is seen last of all and only with an effort. But then we have Plato's disciple Aristotle, who, although he learned from Plato, studied the academy, disagreed with Plato's notion that what is most real is what you can't see. He said, no, all knowledge really begins with observation of the world around you. He says in his book, The Metaphysics, all knowledge begins in wonder. So this idea of looking around at the world, observing and classifying. As you know, he came up with the species classification system that biologists still use today. And as you know, in the ethics, he came up with his own sort of classification system for friendship, various kinds of friendship, various forms of human behavior. So he brought a very scientific approach to his philosophy. Then we studied our Stoic friend, the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, product of the Roman world where Stoic philosophy really took hold. As you know, his foci, like his three things he really focused on, were the concept of nature, how the universe as a whole has a nature and we all have to fit into it and live according to it. The power of human reason and the power within. One of the seminars really got deeply into what this means by concluding that the power within is that kernel of freedom within ourselves that gives us the capacity to choose in any given situation, no matter how difficult our experiences may be, no matter how powerful and overwhelming our emotions may seem. Two philosophers whom we did not study, but who are kind of companions to Marcus Aurelius, were Epicurus and Lucretius. Both of them piggybacked off of the idea that everything is atoms, thinking back to that Ionian philosopher Democritus. They were both convinced that the soul does not survive the death of the body. the soul is really just made of atoms and it disperses into the universe when the person dies. And I think we talked about that in one of your seminars when we talked about the Phaedo, and we talked about the ideas of the soul that Simmias and Sebes were trying to put out there. So that's a whole other school of thought on the relationship of the soul and the body, that the soul is really just something physical that disperses after death. And what this does for you in Epicurean philosophy is it gives you kind of a Jimmy Buffett outlook on life. Don't worry, be happy. There's no afterlife to worry about. The gods exist, but they're not going to bother you. So just live your life. Have a pleasant experience. And then we moved into the Middle Ages, where the dominant unifying theme or idea was, of course, God, because Christianity had kind of filled out or fulfilled or created the unifying structure of philosophy, politics, and society at that time. And Thomas Aquinas, with his idea of the natural law as being written on the human heart, and if you believe in the natural law, then ultimately it points to something like God. And although you can never prove the existence of God by reason, you can see how the existence of God can kind of start to make rational sense. And that was the goal of medieval philosophy, to kind of bring the Bible and science, or the Bible and Aristotle, into one single unified structure. Thomas Aquinas accomplished that as well as anyone. So he tried to bring the natural world, the human world, our emotions and human experiences, into one unified structure that can be explained through faith in God. So, when we get to the modern era, having understood that the project of ancient and medieval philosophers was searching for a unified structure of thought, and we can sort of represent those things through symbols. Of course, we have the mythology of the ancient world, which gave way to a more scientific outlook, the Greek Parthenon with its elegance, the Roman aqueducts with their sturdiness, the medieval cathedrals with their ways of unifying a tremendously diverse structure into one single balanced whole. Is there an architectural symbol that we could use for the modern era? I think there is. It would be this. The project of the modern period was to tear down the unified structures of thought of the Middle Ages. So if you take away only one image or idea from today's lecture, let this be it. The notion of tearing away unified structures of thought. The question, of course, then becomes, and you'll have to resolve this for yourself, did any of the modern philosophers successfully replace those torn away structures with anything? And I have serious doubts about whether they did. C.S. Lewis, as you know, wants to turn the clock back and go back to the ideas of the Middle Ages. So it's kind of perhaps a question for you to hold in your mind as you study modern philosophy. So we're going to kind of look at that theme. The unified structure of the Middle Ages was torn apart in so many different ways. One date that I would pin for the beginning of the modern era would be 1517. Historians of philosophy are going to disagree on this, but for our purposes, put that turning point at 1517. That was the year when the German monk, Martin Luther, posted his 95 Theses, still important to Lutherans today, on the door of a German cathedral, sparking the Protestant Reformation, which ultimately split the Western Church into hundreds, if not thousands, of denominations. I want you to look at this film trailer, because it captures in a kind of overly melodramatic way this whole theme of how Martin Luther and the movement that he sparked really tore apart Christendom, the church, and society, and politics, and everything that went along with it. So take a look at this. It's just a couple minutes. Again, I think looking at it is going to kind of help that idea stick in your head. If you want to, you can stop my clip and look at this clip directly from the hyperlink that's in the PowerPoint.
Martin Luther, are you the author of these writings?
I am. You question the authority of the Church Council, sir?
My conscience is captive to the Word of God. I'm interested in the truth.
Christianity is tearing apart.
And just when we need unity most, you create confusion.
My God, who is this Martin Luther?
This drunken little German monk is intoxicated with himself. Sober him.
You're threatened with excommunication.
But I'm a loyal son of the church.
If you do not recant, you will be delivered to the Inquisition. They'll burn him for sure.
If Luther were to lift one finger, every peasant in Germany would rise up behind him.
Do you recant what you've written?
I cannot, and I will not recant. No!
Luther's getting married to a runaway nun.
He wouldn't dare.
By order of His Holiness, the works of Martin Luther shall be erased from the memory of man!
The Holy War has just begun.
Let somebody else be roasted like a pig! Cowards! You call yourselves Christians?
Damn that heretic.
This will separate us from Rome forever.
I answer to God's law, not Roman.
You are tearing the world apart.
Did you really think there wouldn't be a cost?
Okay, graphic way to capture the basic idea there. So the unified structure of the Middle Ages was torn apart religiously and politically. At the same time that the Protestant Reformation was taking place, nation-states, countries as we know them today in Europe, were beginning to take shape. France, Germany, Poland, Great Britain, Italy, those countries really didn't exist before the beginnings of the modern period. So this whole idea of Christendom, this idea of a Christian unified society, was torn apart. The interesting thing is that that illusion of Christendom still pervades the consciousness of many Christians today. It's why people feel so threatened, for example, by the rise of Islam in the United States. So Christendom, we can question whether it ever really existed, but it was an idea that captured the minds and hearts of people in the Middle Ages that was gradually being torn apart. And the papacy, that means the Catholic Pope, also began to lose political and economic power. One of the popes got into a fight with the King of France over taxes on church property the church didn't want to pay. The French king said he should. He was attacked and imprisoned. And I love the contrast of this picture, this old engraving of the Pope being beaten up by the king's thugs. The contrast between that and the coronation of Charlemagne that we looked at when we studied the Middle Ages. With Charlemagne, you see the king's crown being placed on his head by the Pope. In the modern era, you see the Pope being beaten up by the servants of the king. So it's a complete flip around of the relationship of church and state. In terms of art and literature, the unified structure of the Middle Ages was also challenged, of course, by the Renaissance that you've studied in humanities. The Renaissance or Renaissance was the revival of interest in classical, pre-Christian Greek and Roman art and philosophy and style. There was much more of an emphasis on the human, on the physical body, on the beauty and power and ability of the human physical body that you can see emerging in art. The birth of Venus, with Venus herself, of course, portrayed in beautiful detail. You would never see something like that glorified in medieval artwork. In terms of science, the unified structure of the Middle Ages was also torn apart. The Polish astronomer Copernicus, in the 1500s, came up with a mathematical system which explained the movements of the stars and planets in terms of a heliocentric rather than an Earth-centric universe. In other words, he said, if we assume that the sun is at the center of the solar system, or the center of the universe, then the movements of the stars make much more sense. And he wrote a whole book on this that really revolutionized people's understandings of outer space and the universe itself. Previously, in the ancient period and the Middle Ages, people of course thought the Earth was at the center of the universe. You look up, it looks like the sun, the moon, and the stars are going around us. People assumed that was how it was. There was even this idea in early Christianity, the church father Origen writes about it, that when you die, sorry, there's a glare on the screen from the window here. When you die, your soul rises up through the seven heavens to go to God. So the seven heavens are the moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and then the sphere of the fixed stars is on the outside. And there's this whole idea that angels, or even the Holy Spirit, are responsible for moving those planets in their orbits. So theology and science were married. They were one. You couldn't separate them in the ancient world. These similar ideas even persisted into the Middle Ages. So Copernicus, with his new idea, shattered not only an understanding of space, but an understanding of the human relationship with the spiritual world and even with God, by placing the sun at the center. And then, of course, you have to ask the very real question, is there a place for God in the world as we know it? At the same time, two early physicists, Galileo, Johannes Kepler, and then eventually Isaac Newton, gave birth to the idea of force. As you know from Newton, studying Newton, force equals mass times acceleration. This was a new idea with the modern world. What was groundbreaking or revolutionary about it was the idea that the same forces that move objects on Earth, for example, a falling stone, the same forces move objects in the heavens. So there's really no difference between the physical explanations of things that happen here on Earth and the physical explanations for things that happen in the heavens. So even the Lord's Prayer, on earth as it is in heaven, kind of ceases to have meaning because it's all just one space. Everything operates by the same laws. Earth-shattering idea. To people at the time, of course, we take it for granted. So the unified structure of the Middle Ages was torn apart in the field of the physical sciences also by the rise of experimental method. As you know from studying Aristotle, the physical sciences in the ancient world were primarily conducted through observation. You go out and you study, you observe, you draw, you catalog, you classify, you describe. But in the modern era, we experiment. We create an artificial situation that can tell us whether a theory that we have is likely to be true. Francis Bacon, an early modern philosopher, used the expression, scientists put nature on the rack. The rack is a medieval torture device. So we torture nature to get answers out of her. In philosophy proper, although all of these disciplines really belong to philosophy, but in philosophy as pure thought, we can talk about the modern turn to the subject. The subject being the individual person as a perceiver, a thinker, a feeler, a knower. So there was a movement from thinking of truth as out there to a focus on the individual as the perceiver. Truth is in here. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Truth is in the eye of the beholder. What's true for me is true for me. What's true for you may be different, but it's true for you. That is a very modern idea. Ancient and medieval philosophers would never have thought that way. Remember Plato's cave? If you can think back to humanities, we may or may not have studied it in any one of my given philosophy courses. But we have the little people trapped in the cave, staring at the wall, and they're looking at shadows of images cast by a firelight, and of course that's all an illusion. Truth is when you leave the cave and go out and you see the sunlight. So the truth is out there. Plato's cave is a great symbol of that whole ancient idea. The truth is something you've got to strive for. The illusions that we hold are the ideas we have as individuals. Truth is out there, and it's true for everyone. Some people see it, some people don't, but the truth is the same for everyone. In the modern world, that whole idea gets turned around. Truth isn't out there. Truth is really within the individual as a perceiver. Modern philosophy, therefore, places a lot of emphasis on the power of human reason, but also a tremendous amount of doubt about what can be known. David Hume, an English philosopher, is the most famous skeptic, and he talks about going through libraries and purging libraries of all the books that don't contain real certain truth in them. And of course, books on theology and metaphysics are the first to go, because all you can really trust is your senses. Nothing's certain but what you can perceive with the senses. So, in philosophy, with the modern turn to the subject, from an emphasis on the community, we shift to an emphasis on the individual. I believe personally, this is just me, that in contemporary American and European societies, we are still wrestling with this problem. What is the relationship between the individual and the community? What is the relationship between the wants and needs of the individual and the common good? The modern philosopher Thomas Hobbes, although I haven't put him on our list of people to study, he's a political philosopher, I think he really gives rise or gives voice to this seminal idea of the importance and the power of the individual. So let's just kind of talk through or mention some key modern philosophers. I have suggestions for whom you might like to study. Regardless of whom you choose, it's important for you just to know something about each of these individuals. René Descartes is famous for the saying, "I think, therefore I am." He was looking for certitude. Existence is absolutely the only thing that you can be absolutely certain about. If I'm thinking, if my brain is somehow working, I know that I exist. He was born in France, attended a Jesuit college, and was worried his whole life about what the church thought of his ideas. He was fascinated by math, and he contributed to the development of geometry and algebra, the system of so-called Cartesian coordinates, x and y axes that you probably hated in high school. That is named after him. He served in the military and eventually moved to the Netherlands and then to Sweden, and ended up serving as a tutor to the Swedish queen. Here's his little symbol of Cartesian coordinates, as well as that famous quote. Associate that quote with Descartes. "I think, therefore I am." Then there's Charles Darwin. Published his famous book, Origin of Species, I believe in 1850 or 1851. His first job was as a pastor, but he was restless and longed for adventure, had an interest in biology, so he took a job to join a sailing ship, an exploration on a ship called the Beagle, Her Majesty's ship the Beagle. His job was to collect samples from around the world, catalog them, and bring them back to England to be placed in museums and used by biologists there. As he traveled, he was struck with wonder at the variety and beauty of life. He collected thousands of specimens or samples and wrote about them, made drawings, wrote descriptions of what he saw. In one of his notes he describes the forest as a temple filled with the varied productions of the God of nature. So anyone who says that Charles Darwin didn't believe in God needs to think again. Charles Darwin, of course, is famous for the idea of natural selection, or as we call it, I don't think he used the term, we call it evolution. And Darwin is, by some people, portrayed as a hero. By others, he's portrayed as the devil, depending on whether you like or hate the theory of evolution. But whether you like it or hate it, the theory of evolution lies at the basis of all modern biology and medicine, so it's very important to understand. And I think it's good for us as students to get past the hype about Darwin, to get past the talk about Darwin, and read what he actually wrote, how he actually thought, and decide for yourself whether his ideas make sense. Then there's Friedrich Nietzsche, German philosopher, 1800s. I like to call him the bad boy of philosophy. I compare him to Bart Simpson, or at least his ideas to Bart Simpson, because he was, in a way, rejecting the old systems of morality and lifting up an idea of morality that in fact is utterly amoral. I do want to show you a quick clip from a wonderful film titled When Nietzsche Wept. The actor in the film portrays Nietzsche in a way that, to me, captures not only his basic personality, but some of his basic ideas. He's famous for the quote, "God is dead." He was an in-your-face atheist, and he had reasons for what he believed. And so this trailer from the film, or opening scene from the film, portrays him teaching, ticking off a variety of people. But then it portrays a young woman, a Russian poet, who took an interest in his philosophy and approached him and wanted to talk to him about his ideas. And she articulates some of the main implications of his thought. His ideas, he apparently knew Sigmund Freud when Freud was younger. His ideas contributed some of the foundations of modern psychology. It could be interesting for us to study him, Group 2 is going to do their seminar on Friedrich Nietzsche. So if you decide you have an interest in Nietzsche, and if you're in Group 1, I'd like to invite you to consider joining Group 2's seminar, though we don't want it to get too big. And we're going this semester to have a guest lecturer, Michael McGeehee, guest facilitator, I should say, lead that seminar, so it should be interesting. So let me show you this clip.
And are you responsible for our patient's despair?
He believes I am.
Where has God gone? I shall tell you. God is dead. We all have killed him. You, and I. God will burn you in hell! After the death of Buddha, his shadow was shown for centuries in caves. A gruesome, gruesome shadow. God will punish you as Satan! Well, given the way of people, there may be caves, thank you, for thousands of years in which God's shadow will still be shown. Vanquish the shadow within yourself!
Friedrich Mitterloo Salome, brilliant poet from Russia.
Fascinating lecture to fall on so few ears. Why are people so afraid of you, Professor?
Oh, truth is a fearsome thing.
Why do you say God is dead, and not that he never existed?
What do you think?
And God has ceased to be a reckoning force in people's lives.
An interesting interpretation.
But if God is dead, then everything is permitted. No morals, no rules. Without God, who will organize our society? What is the solution to your godless proposition?
From what stars have we dropped down to each other here? Have it as in.
I was immediately attracted to him.
So if you're together watching this clip with a group, maybe talk about it a little bit. If you didn't see it real well in my video, you can go to the PowerPoint and use the hyperlink, but talk about it among yourselves. What do you think of this idea God is dead? What do you think it could mean? Does it have an impact on society? Without religion, without a concept of God, how will society be organized? Are we seeing the implications of that in our society today? So maybe talk about this a little bit among yourselves before you go on. Next, we have Anna J. Cooper, a woman who lived to be, I think, around 100 years old. She was born into slavery, but lived to see the 1960s. So her life spanned a tremendous part of American history. She was, I believe, the fourth African-American woman ever to get her PhD. She started or helped to maintain a girls' school in Washington. Her main work is called A Voice from the South, where she tries to speak on behalf of those who were oppressed during much of American history. And her book is considered to be the foundation today of the womanist movement, somewhat different from the feminist movement, for whom she has some criticisms. What's deeply philosophical about her thinking is her view of history. She piggybacked off of the ideas of the German philosopher Hegel, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who was the first to come up with this idea that that things don't stay the same. In the ancient world and in the Middle Ages, there was kind of this assumption that despite Heraclitus, things don't really change. Either history repeats itself, or there's just kind of this static notion of the universe as unchanging. Hegel busted all that open and said, there are real changes that have been happening throughout human history. Darwin, of course, busted it open and said, there are real changes that have been happening throughout the history of life itself, and there are forces that are driving these changes, and it has a direction. We're moving from someplace to someplace else as a race, as humanity as a whole. Of course, we could debate whether we're making progress or going backwards, but nowadays we have this idea that history is moving, and it's continually moving. And it's really Hegel and philosophers like Anna J. Cooper, who adopted his ideas, that gave us this notion. 500 years ago, people really didn't think that way. She also makes the point that woman woman as a gender has a certain agency. She is a historical force. That's a moving and active part of the story. So in that sense, her ideas are fascinating and fairly radical. Last but not least, Viktor Frankl. I chose him partly because he represents the 20th century because of his experiences, but also because going into our study of Carl Jung, he himself is a psychoanalyst, psychotherapist, psychologist, and he has contributed some major ideas to psychology today. He was a medical doctor, a psychiatrist or psychotherapist, and also a Holocaust survivor. Let's see, I have a few more details on his life here that I didn't put into a slide, so let me kind of go back. I don't know a whole lot about his life myself, but I do have some good notes on him. He was born in Vienna, Austria. His family struggled during the First World War. In high school, he was interested in psychology, and he eventually, I believed, after he was out of high school, maybe in college, he organized counseling centers for high school students. And as a result of his work, the suicide rate dropped. So his work actually had an impact on actual cases, high school students in Austria. In 1938, Hitler invaded Austria. Frankl tried to protect his patients from euthanasia. In 1942, he, his wife, and his parents were forced to move to a ghetto near Prague, former Czechoslovakia. In 1944, he was sent to Auschwitz and other various concentration camps, which he survived. However, his wife, his brother, and his parents died in the camps. He eventually remarried. I believe he moved to the United States, earned a PhD in philosophy, continued practicing psychotherapy, lectured, and wrote. His most famous book is Man's Search for Meaning. In the first part of the book, he talks of his experiences in the concentration camp. In the second part of the book, he goes more deeply into his philosophy. What's unique about his work is that he would heal or cure patients of some of their neuroses by showing them, simply by showing them, that their life has a meaning and a purpose. And that's the section of the book that we'd focus on if you chose Viktor Frankl to study him further. It's important for you to be aware of the movement known as existentialist philosophy. Frankl is one representative. Jean-Paul Sartre, a French philosopher, is another. Some existentialists have their religious faith, others do not. They deny the existence of God. But the key point to existentialist philosophy, there is no human nature to define you. You are not predefined. You as an individual spring up in the world and you define who you are. You discover or you create the meaning for your life. There's no plan for your life. There's no reason for everything. There's no overarching nature, as the Stoics claimed, that you have to find your place in. It's all about you as an individual and the meaning that you create for your life. There's no inherent meaning to life. It's meaningless in a sense. So within existentialism, there's this idea that you can succumb to despair if you give up on the idea of finding a meaning. So it's up to you at each moment of your existence to define who you are. So be aware of existentialist philosophy as a movement, even if you don't choose to study Viktor Frankl. Some existentialists, like Sartre, deny the existence of God. Others believe in God. Here's a way to capture Sartre's idea. Of course, you've seen this artwork before. It's on the ceiling of a chapel in the Vatican in Rome. It's a famous scene that portrays graphically the idea of the creation or the gift of life to human beings by God. So of course we have Adam, or the primordial human being, on the left. We have this image of God as an old white man with a beard on the right, stretching his hand toward Adam to give him the gift of life. Well, existentialists would basically, Sartre would basically drop out this half of the picture. There's no God. There's just you. So you are creating and defining who you are at any given moment. Ultimately, and this is how we'll wrap up our discussion of modern philosophy, it's just you. It's all about the individual. I personally believe that we are still in the modern era. We're still thinking of the individual as primary. But maybe we're starting to realize some of the struggles and difficulties and problems that can cause. Have any of the modern philosophers given us a way out of the struggles, possibilities, challenges? Decide for yourself. So do your journal entry. Start by summarizing what stands out to you about the modern period in philosophy. How would you, in a single main idea, and maybe 2 or 3 details, describe the modern period? That's important for you to be able to do, to summarize this for yourself. But then, tell me which philosopher you likely would want to study, maybe a little bit about why, and I will use that feedback from your journals to choose which readings to give you. I will scan and post readings to Blackboard or give you a link. There are links to some of these readings on the internet. But I also will place copies in room 300 for you to pick up at your leisure, labeled with your name and which philosopher it is. I intend to do that I'm giving this little lecture on Wednesday, October 23rd. I intend to do that by 4 p.m. today, but if you're having a problem getting a hold of the reading, call me, see me, I'll find some way to get it to you. I wish we had more time. Your next assignment is a research report on your philosopher. Then after that is your seminar. So please contact me if you have any questions about this. Discuss it among yourselves, do your journal entry, turn your journals in, slide them under my door, or bring them to the classroom where I'm at when you're finished with the session. Thank you.